Through healing, this week we are going to be moving upward. So, all of the topics that we'll be covering today are really related to our upward experience. And just to introduce myself briefly, I know this slide didn't come through. It's the only slide that didn't. And so we should be good to go for the slides for the rest of today. But to introduce myself, my name is Megan Johnson. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed in both California and Colorado. I've been working in the mental health field now for a little bit over a decade and have been with BetterHelp now for about a year. I started last November and have been doing these groupinars for the last handful of months. I also just got my doctorate in clinical psychology, and my research interest was the relationship between spirituality and resilience during the pandemic. So throughout this series, you will see bits and pieces about resiliency, spirituality, kind of sprinkled throughout. This is a 4-part series. I do encourage you to come to all 4 parts. Some great content is covered in all of them. You don't have to go in any particular order. So this week, as I already said, is Upward. Technically, it's kind of the 3rd part of the 4th series, but if this is your first time joining me, then no problem at all. I just do encourage you to, at some point, make it to the other 3. The topics covered today will be mindfulness, the brain and neuroplasticity, spirituality, emotional regulation, problem solving, and thoughts. So, as you can see, we are going to cover a lot of different topics, 6 topics in total. We have 60 minutes together. So, this might feel a little bit fast and furious tonight. And my encouragement to you is, if it does feel like we're breezing through a topic that you want to spend more time on, to bring that to session with your therapist. So let this be kind of a sampler platter appetizer of these different topics, and do dive into them deeper with your therapist if they really resonate with you, or you realize that you haven't had much opportunity to kind of explore the topic in your life. So, some objectives for today. My hope for you today is that you will walk away from this hour with more awareness around related to each of these different topics. We are going to be also practicing some new skills. So, I'm hoping that you will also walk away with new practical skills. And then, as I mentioned, today is really just going to be an overview. So please do go into further depth with your BetterHelp therapist. So that is one of the great things about all of us in this community, is we do have our own individual therapist. So please take advantage of that. And then I do want to mention also that there will be parts of our hour together that will be more interactive. We'll be relying on the chat feature of this platform to interact with each other. I will not be moderating the chat throughout this presentation, throughout the hour. I'll just be kind of popping in and out of reading things when we do the interactive portion. So, and that will be clear. We'll kind of pause and I'll present a question to the group. If you have any questions, feel free at that time to put those in the chat as well. If I have time, I will hopefully be able to answer some questions. I won't be able to read everybody's comments just because of the nature of how big these of a group we can be, but I will try to read as many as I can. And last thing that I want to say about that is, please do feel free to continue a conversation with each other throughout this hour. I do need to ask that whatever you do comment on or share with each other, be supportive and kind. Have never had any problems with that, but do need to make sure that this feels like a safe community for everybody. So feel free to continue a dialogue, support each other, ask each other questions throughout, and just make sure that we're being kind and respectful of each other. Okay, so I introduced myself to you. Where are you participating from today, and which upward topic are you the most interested in? Let me go ahead and take a look. Yes, so I'm seeing Glasgow, Scotland. Awesome. Hello. I'm in the UK as well. I'm in England. Okay, so I'm seeing a question about the slides. I do get this question often. My understanding is that you will receive, so after tonight's presentation, you will be sent a link with a video recording of the presentation, and with that should also that email should also include an attachment of these slides. So look out for that, and that will give you a chance to have access to these PowerPoint slides. All right, hello, California. Mindfulness. I'm seeing some interest in Canada. Welcome. Emotional regulation. Lots of interest in emotional regulation. Great. I really like that topic as well. Emotional regulation is very, very important for our relationships and our mental health in general. Very good. Lots of emotional regulation. Very cool. This can help me. Seeing what you're most interested in can help me kind of gauge which sections I might rush through a little bit more quickly and which ones I might take at a slower pace. Very cool. Washington, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Ohio. I'm seeing some interest in mindfulness and spirituality. Jamaica. Welcome. Very good. Happy to have you all here. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. So we will start with mindfulness. I'll start with just a quick definition. This definition comes from the American Psychological Association, and they define mindfulness quite simply as an awareness of one's own internal states and surroundings. And I like to add to that definition also being non-judgmental, because sometimes we can be aware of what's going on for us internally or of our environment, and we can be aware of it in a judgmental way, and that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about mindfulness. Mindfulness, really, the idea of mindfulness is that it's going to help us to be in a state where we're feeling peaceful and calm, relaxed and alert, not more distressed, which when we bring that judgment to the table, we can tend to start to feel more anxious or distressed. Okay, and mindfulness can either be formal, so such as like a formal meditation where you're sitting down and following some kind of a guided meditation or practicing some kind of meditation that you do on your own, or it can also just be a lifestyle. So we can practice mindfulness throughout our everyday lives. And I'm going to give some examples of different activities and ways that you can try to incorporate mindfulness into daily activities. So really, you don't have to think of mindfulness as being formal, as being somewhere where you go to a quiet area by yourself and really formally sit down and follow a meditation. It can just be things that we incorporate into our daily routine. Okay, some benefits of mindfulness. There's been a lot of research done on this topic of mindfulness, and with that, there has been a lot of research confirming the benefits of mindfulness. So, mindfulness, as I already mentioned, can help get us into a relaxed state of relaxed alertness, which is important. A lot of times we can feel really alert, but feel maybe a little bit more on edge, or when we're anxious, sometimes we can be in a high alert state or in a relaxed state where we're kind of zoning out watching TV or zoning out on our phones, kind of scrolling around. But this combination of being both relaxed and also alert is an important practice for us to be able to get into, and mindfulness can really help us to achieve that. Research has also shown that mindfulness increases our serotonin, which helps us just to feel good. It supports positive mood, sleep, and then also our digestion. So there's some physiological benefits of it as well, including strengthening our immune system, our cardiovascular system, and it can help to improve or reduce chronic pain as well. It stimulates our parasympathetic nervous system, which helps us to get into that relaxed state. It helps us to distance ourselves from unhelpful thoughts and improve emotional regulation. So it's good for our mental health in the sense that it can help us to see be like more objectively take a look at our thoughts and our emotions versus feeling like we need to react to them as soon as we have them. It also improves our relationship satisfaction, helps us to feel more empathy for other people. And then, lastly, at least for the ones that I'm going to mention, because I'm sure there are a lot more benefits of mindfulness, um, there's been some research showing that it improves our memory and our focus as well. Okay, so some examples of ways that we can practice mindfulness. So, as I already mentioned, mindfulness can be very formal. It can be a meditation. There's lots of resources, lots of different apps for guided meditations that you can do, including body scans, loving kindness meditations, um, lots of different guided imagery type meditations, lots of different types of meditations that we can do that are more formal, that we can use an app or some other kind of resource, go to a meditation class where we can really be helped to walk through that meditative process. It can also be more informal. So we can practice mindfulness when we go out on a walk. And what that might look like is paying attention to the way that your body feels when you're walking, paying attention to the feeling of your feet hitting the ground as you're taking steps. Paying attention to, if you're outside, what it feels like for the breeze, to hit your face. Paying attention to the smells you might be having. So we can really incorporate our five senses as we're practicing mindfulness. The things that you can hear, the things that you can smell, the things that you can see, the things that you can feel. And then five senses is kind of a more structured activity of doing just that. And we will practice this together in just a moment. So a five senses mindfulness activity would be, and you can do this anywhere, noticing five things that you see, four things that you feel, three things that you hear, two things that you smell, and one thing that you taste. And you can kind of just cycle through that. So repeating it over and over again until you really do start to notice the relaxation benefits of mindfulness. What I will mention about mindfulness as well before I kind of describe these remaining skills that are on this slide is that similar to a woman during childbirth, you wouldn't practice breathing skills for the first time when you're in labor. So with that, any of these emotional regulation or mindfulness skills that I'm talking about today, my encouragement to you would be to practice this in normal day-to-day life, because when we do that, it can feel a lot more accessible to us when we're in a state of panic or extreme stress or high levels of anxiety, or really intense emotions that we're having a hard time regulating. So if we are in the habit of practicing these regularly, not only do we have a lot of benefits to our brain and the way that our brain is rewiring, which we'll talk about more, but also these skills will be a lot more accessible to us if we've practiced them, if they've been rehearsed, than they would if we're trying it for the first time when we're not in a very good headspace. Okay, so mindful driving. This could include driving is a great time to practice mindfulness. One, because you can't really go anywhere else; you're stuck in the car. Also, driving can be a time when we would otherwise maybe feel a little bit more distressed, stuck in traffic, rushing to get somewhere. So this might look like paying attention to what you're seeing in your environment, what you're seeing out the window, paying attention to how it feels to have the steering wheel in your hand, the back of the chair that you're sitting in, the car seat, the seat that you're sitting in your car, the air conditioning on your feet, whatever it is that you can notice, using your different senses about the experience of driving versus being focused on the thoughts that you might have and the racing thoughts that you might be having. Single tasking, the idea of this is to just do one task at a time. We live in a world where we tend to do a lot of multitasking, and there's been some research that has shown that we're actually not more productive when we multitask. We're more productive when we do one task at a time. Deep breathing. A strategy for this is called square breathing, which is picking a number. So let's say the number 5, breathing in for that number, holding it for that number. So breathing in for 5, holding it for 5, breathing out for 5, holding it for 5, and then going around. So it's a square because you're doing it the same amount of counts each time. So breathing in for 5, holding it for 5, breathing out for 5, holding it for 5. Okay, mindful eating. Most of us eat at least 3 times a day. And this can be a good opportunity for us to notice the taste, notice what we're eating, what it feels like to be swallowing our food, what it feels like for us to hold whatever utensil we might have in our hand. And then lastly, mindful movement. And this can be things like Tai Chi or yoga, where we are engaged in an activity where we're moving our body and really aware of what it feels like for our body to be moving through space. Okay, so as I said, we will practice this 5 senses activity. So I will go ahead and just lead us and you can follow along. And if you want to, you can pop it in the chat as well. I'm not going to take the time to read off what you do put in the chat because we do have a lot to cover today. But if you do want to share, what you're noticing, please do. Okay, so 5 things that you see. So right now, I see a box of tissues in my office, a printer, glass of water, a pen, and a mouse. 4 things that I hear the buzz of my computer modem. I hear the sound of my voice. I hear the sound of myself breathing, and I hear the hum of the heater. 3 things that I feel. I can feel my back up against the chair that I'm sitting in. I can feel myself touching my hands, and I can feel the hair on my neck. 2 things that I smell. This one can be more challenging for me. I can smell the smell of paper in the room that I'm in. And I can also smell the shampoo in my hair. And then one thing that I taste a cinnamon raisin bagel, which I just ate before starting this tonight. Okay, so I'm hoping that you were able to follow along and just at least get the experience. The first time we do it, it might feel a little bit odd, but at least get the experience of what it is like to kind of walk through this exercise. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about the brain. So just some fun facts about the brain, really just to give us an appreciation for how cool it is that we all have this organ. So the brain is 3 pounds. It has 1.1 trillion cells, including 100 billion gray matter neurons. It is always on, so our brain never takes a break, even when we're sleeping. It's about 2% of our body's weight, but uses about 25% of its oxygen. So our brain is highly, highly metabolically active. The number of possible brain states that we can have is 1 followed by a million zeros. So basically an infinite number of brain states. It is the most complex object known in the universe. So our brains are amazing, incredibly complicated, super, super, really fascinating organs. And then also want to mention kind of this idea of neurons that fire together, wire together. Really, that idea is that when we are using a part of our brain, when we're using a neural pathway with repetition, and I'll give some examples of this in a second, that those neural pathways really get strengthened in our brain. So the more that we use our brain in a certain way, the more automatic of a process that comes for us. So we really do strengthen those neural pathways in our brains with repetition. Okay, so this idea of neuroplasticity, I also want to talk about, and this a definition of this taken from the American Psychological Association is that neuroplasticity is the ability of the nervous system to change in response to experience or environmental stimulation. So, just like I was just mentioning, for example, following an injury, remaining neurons may adopt certain functions previously performed by those that were damaged, or a change in reactivity of the nervous system and its components may result from constant successive activations. So, the more we learn about the brain, the more hopeful it seems like things are for us to really be able to make changes to the structure of our brains, make changes really with changing our habits to really strengthen part of our brains kind of strategically. Okay, so some examples of neuroplasticity. So when you meditate, if we are really committed to practicing these mindfulness skills and formal meditation, we can trust that our interior cingulate cortex and insula will thicken. And this is really the part of our brain that helps to regulate our body. So we can trust that these part of our brains will thicken and therefore bring more blood and more support cells to that area. Another example is that cab drivers have a thicker hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for spatial awareness, for visual spatial memory. And this is really just because part of their job is to need to practice, to use their hippocampus to practice that visual spatial memory. And then pianists, another example, have thicker motor cortices, and that's really from that practice of those finger movements as part of playing the piano. So there is a lot of hope that we can change our brain through what we are practicing with regularity. So I also want to mention that human nature is to have a negativity bias. So you're not being a negative person if you are noticing negative things or have a tendency to kind of see the negatives the negatives in your life. So that's really just human nature. And it's human nature for a reason. It's for our survival. It's protected us more to be able to notice what's negative, what's kind of wrong, than it has for us to be focused on positive things throughout human history. So an example of this is it's going to be more important for our survival to see the snake on the ground than it is for us to notice the roses or even notice the carrots, because there might be other opportunities for a food source if we miss the carrots, but if we miss the snake and get bitten, then that could be the end of us. So there is good reason why humans do have a tendency to focus on negatives from a survival perspective. However, when we're not talking about our survival, when we're talking about thriving in life, it can be helpful to set aside that negativity bias and to practice setting aside it so that we can be a little bit more biased towards noticing positive experiences and noticing the positives in our lives and in our relationships as well. So we can do this through something called self-directed neuroplasticity. And that's using the mind in targeted ways to change the brain, to change the mind for the better. And I'll give some examples of ways that we can do this. But really the idea is to, when you notice something positive, to give yourself an opportunity for that to be an experience versus something that you just kind of notice as a fleeting thought. And I do like to use a bike analogy here, just to kind of normalize the fact that when we are trying to make changes in the way that we think and the experiences that we're focusing on, it can feel more difficult at first, more unnatural at first. And it's kind of like that idea of mountain biking and going along a path for the first time. The first time that you go along a path that no one's been on, it's going to feel like this kind of big bump that you have to go over. But once you've gone over it multiple times, then it starts to be a smoother, more flat, there becomes a path there. So it's kind of like that when we're making changes to the way, when we're making changes to our brain. Initially, it might feel a little bit unnatural, but with practice, it becomes easier and more natural to us. So, these are practical strategies for how we can practice that self-directed neuroplasticity. So that idea of being able to take in the good, to let our positive experiences to really be experiences that we sit with versus kind of a passing thought or something that we notice and then okay, that's all there is to it. So first practical strategy is let positive facts become positive experiences. So, what I was just mentioning. So, allow yourself to feel good if you get something done versus, okay, I checked that one off my to do list and now on to the next ones. Let yourself really sit with the fact of, oh, I got that done and really kind of celebrate it, even if it's just for a couple of seconds. If someone is nice to you, or if you notice a good quality in yourself, sit with that. And when we sit with the good, it really doesn't take very long. So we can spend 5 seconds. And there's a book that I would recommend by Rick Hansen called The Buddha's Brain, which really does talk about this idea of self directed neuroplasticity. And he says in that book, again, the book is The Buddha's Brain by Rick Hansen. He says, really, all you need is 5 seconds. 5 seconds of letting yourself sit with a positive experience to make a small shift in your brain. So, an example of this would be your morning coffee in the morning, if you're a coffee drinker, or tea. Instead of just drinking it mindlessly because it's something that you do every single day and it doesn't feel like it's a big deal, allow yourself to be mindful of that experience, especially if it's one that you really enjoy, allowing yourself to savor it and really notice the smell and the taste, and just kind of pause for 5 seconds and really soak it in. Um, and we're going to practice this in a second as well. So any kind of positive experience, whether it be eating, holding your partner's hand, listening to music that you really enjoy, let yourself really focus on enjoying that positive experience, even if it's just for 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds, because that is going to help to rewire your brain in a way that helps you to favor more positive experiences versus that negativity bias that I was mentioning. And then the last practical strategy here is intent and sense. And this is for those of you that might be more kind of imaginative, visual type people. And that is sense the positive experience and imagine that it's soaking into you. Imagine that you're a sponge and it's water pouring over you, water you're absorbing and becoming a part of you. So really the idea with all of these is just to take more time with those positive experiences, let yourself really let them just soak in. Cool. Okay, so we will practice together. So I'm hoping that we can all practice for 20 seconds, just really sitting with a positive experience. So some ideas, choose whatever you have access to, whatever feels positive for you. But some ideas that I was kind of imagining that we all might have access to is looking at a photo of something, either a place or a person or a pet that you tend to feel happy looking at. Hold your own hands, so clasping your hands and holding onto them. Sip of a beverage that you might have handy, or a bite of food if you happen to have food handy, or playing a song that you enjoy listening to. So, as I said, even something like thinking about a memory, a positive memory. So, these are just some ideas. I'm going to go ahead and pause for 20 seconds for us all just to really pay attention to it. So, we will start now. Cool. So that was 20 seconds. Hopefully, you all were able to take those 20 seconds and to find something that you could do for that time that really does feel enjoyable. And us all doing that together, we all made a small change to our brain. So it really is that simple that we can start to make changes to our brain really just in 20 seconds. So cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and move along to talking about spirituality. So, spirituality can be defined as the way in which people understand their lives in view of their ultimate meaning and value. So, our spirituality can really help us to have a sense of meaning and value, and it can really help with some of the existential questions that we can be faced in life, which is like, why are we here? What is our purpose? What is our meaning in life? So, um, some benefits of spirituality. Spirituality can have a significant impact on both physical and our mental health, mental well-being. And from the research that from when I was reviewing research on spirituality, because I mentioned that this topic is especially of interest to me, really what I found was that more so than kind of whether or not you have a relationship with spirituality being important, it was the quality of that relationship. So our relationship with religion and spirituality, if we have a positive one, can be tremendously beneficial to, as I already said, our mental and physical well-being. Also, if we've experienced spiritual trauma or rejection from the church, or a variety of different, shame and guilt associated with our faith, or spiritual or religious practices, if there's been damage to that relationship, there are times that spirituality or religion can feel like it has a negative impact on our life. So, my encouragement to you as we're talking about spirituality and kind of opening up this topic is, if you are someone that has had a negative experience with your spirituality, your spiritual beliefs, or religion, to really explore that with your therapist. Because the idea, the hope here wouldn't be that with bad experiences, an individual would just give up entirely on their faith or religion or spiritual practices, but instead that they could really resolve that and get to a place where they had a healthy relationship with their spirituality, and get to a place where that spirituality was adding value to their life again. So, research has shown that some spiritual practices that are most crucial, most beneficial to mental health include prayer, meditation, which we've already talked a bit about, attending religious services, spending time in nature, and reading spiritual texts. So, the attending spiritual services can be a super beneficial part of religion and spirituality, because it can give you access to hopefully a very supportive community where you can feel a sense of belonging and acceptance. And then I think I covered everything that's already on this slide. So let's go ahead and move along. So as I already mentioned, religion can both be protective against low resilience. So religion can be a very positive thing in someone's life, or it can be a negative if that relationship with the religion or spirituality is a negative relationship. So it really is a quality over quantity thing when we're talking about the benefits to spirituality and religion on resilience and mental health. Okay, so for the purposes of today, and again, I do want to emphasize that if this is a topic that really strikes a chord with you, please bring that to session. Please don't shy away from talking about your spirituality with your therapist. I do think that's something that we don't do enough of in mental health, is talking about our spirituality. So please, please, please bring it up. For the purposes of today, we're going to talk about some spiritual principles. And really, these spiritual principles transcend any specific type of religion. And so that's why I wanted to cover these today. These spiritual principles come from, there's 12 of them, come from the 12-step program, such as Alcoholics Anonymous or any of the other 12-step programs. And they're based on each of the different 12 steps. for the 12-step program. So these spiritual principles that we'll be talking a little bit about today are honesty, hope, faith, courage, integrity, willingness, humility, love, discipline, patience and perseverance, awareness, and service. So we'll go ahead and kind of quickly breeze through each of these different principles, and then we'll do a little interactive portion where I can ask you to identify one, and how you can kind of carry one of these spiritual principles into your life over the next day, kind of immediately following this hour that we have together. So, honesty is fairness and straightforwardness of conduct, adherence to the facts. Hope can be defined as expecting with a desire, something on which hopes are centered. Faith is complete confidence, belief, and trust. Courage is firmness of mind and will in the face of extreme difficulty, mental or moral strength to withstand fear. Integrity is the quality or state of being complete and undivided, so soundness. And then willingness is being prompt to act or respond, accepted and done of choice and without reluctance. And then humility is not being proud or haughty, not being arrogant or assertive. Instead, it's a clear and concise understanding of what we are, followed by a sincere desire to become what we can be. And then love is unselfish concern that freely accepts another in loyalty and seeks his good to hold dear. And then discipline is training that corrects, molds, or perfects the mental faculties or moral character to bring under control, to train or develop by instruction. And then patience, perseverance is being steadfast despite opposition or adversity, being able or willing to bear, to persist in an understanding in spite of counter influences. And then awareness is being alive and alert, vigilance and observing. And then lastly, service. So a helpful act, contribution to the welfare of others, useful labor that does not produce a tangible commodity. So, is there one of these? And I'll go ahead and toggle back to the list of spiritual principles. But is there one of these that you'd like to focus on for the next 24 hours? And if so, if you're able to pick one, what's one action you can take in line with this spiritual principle? So let's see, anyone who wants to share, go ahead and share as much as you feel comfortable. Discipline in my meditation practice. Awesome, awesome. Will you be wearing, I'm seeing another question, will you be willing to share this presentation? I think this is the only one from your series I missed. Thanks. Great. Happy to see that you've been able to come to the other presentations. You should be emailed after we finish this evening sent an email with a link which will include a video recording of this presentation, which should last for 7 days. And with that should also include the slides. Hope and faith, but how do we practice that? Good question. Does anybody have any ideas about how we can practice hope and faith? Patience with myself. That's really good. Being willing to get in touch with my spirituality. Very good. Discipline and healthier eating. That's great. That's very practical. Faith in my life path, since none of us know what the futures will be like. Very good. Patience, definitely learning to appreciate life's a journey and not rush. I can relate to that for sure. Hope for good things in the future. We will be talking more about hope next week during our forward week. So please join me for that, and we'll have a chance to talk more about hope and how to kind of carry that principle into our life. how to practice hope and faith. So, as I mentioned, next week we will talk more about some practical strategies for incorporating hope into life. But I think, in terms of how to practice hope and faith in your life, you could practice being hopeful and having faith in your mental wellness journey. Good. Okay. So, what would that look like? What would that look like? For me, I think being hopeful looks like taking actions that line up with the end goal that I'm hoping for. So, if I'm hoping to be able to complete a half marathon or a marathon, which would be, a difficult accomplishment, then I'm going to start running and setting a plan for myself to build up mileage to where I'm getting closer to meeting that goal. So, the way to be practical with our hope is to have this goal that we're hoping for and then start to take actions that starts to lead up to what it is that we're hoping for. I get that. Practicing hope and faith could be difficult when changes in life have yet to be seen. I do understand that. I especially understand this idea of having hope and faith in things that we have no control over can be really, really difficult. I'm hoping to get my degree in photography. So yeah, to start with this principle of hope, sometimes it can be simpler to have our hopes be set on things that we do have some power and control over being able to achieve. Okay, let's go ahead and move us along. Please continue your conversation in the chat, but I'm gonna start to move us forward a little bit more so that we have time to talk about emotional regulation, problem solving, and thoughts before we wrap up. So, emotional regulation, a quick definition here, is the ability to modulate an emotion or set of emotions. Explicit emotion regulation requires conscious monitoring using techniques such as learning to construe situations differently in order to manage them better. And this is what we're going to be focusing on today, is this idea of explicit emotion regulation. Implicit emotion regulation happens naturally, so operates without deliberate monitoring. It modulates the intensity or duration of an emotional response without the need for awareness. And emotional regulation, this is good news, this is hopeful, does tend to increase naturally throughout our lifespan. So, in theory, as adults, we do have better emotional regulation skills than we did when we were teenagers or toddlers, for example. Some benefits to emotional regulation. There is a link between emotional regulation, the ability to do so, and resilience, a lower risk of anxiety and depression, improved relationships, when we improved impulse control, which leads to less regrettable experiences, so less kind of shame and guilt around the decisions that we're making. And when we have better impulse control, better able to focus, better problem solving skills, increased confidence, and then increased in overall levels of happiness as well. So, needless to say, a ton of benefits to emotional regulation. And I was happy to see that a lot of you tonight were really interested in this topic. So, some tools for emotional regulation. One, being aware of our triggers can be really helpful. And being aware of our triggers can help in a few different ways. Our triggers, if we're aware of them, may be something that we can avoid. So an example of this is if we're recovering from alcohol abuse or alcoholism, and we know that it's a trigger for us to go to a bar, we may choose to not go to a bar. Or when we can't completely avoid our triggers, we can do things to kind of modify the trigger, if that makes sense. So if we are sticking with that example of recovering from addiction, if we're going to be going to a party where we know that there might be alcohol served, we might bring something that we can drink. Might bring a soda or a drink that we enjoy really drinking as a replacement so that we're not as tempted for the alcohol. We may also bring a buddy, someone else who is trying to be sober, as like a buddy system for that support. We might choose to be on the opposite side of the room of the bar. So there's ways that if we're aware of our triggers, we can avoid them or modify them in some way. Monitoring our thoughts, we're going to talk a bit about this. I'm not going to talk too much now because we will talk about that in a future slide. Exercise, hugely important for emotional regulation. Both anxiety and depression is exercise. Relaxation, mindfulness strategies, which we've already talked about. distraction, and we're going to talk more about this in the next slide using the 6 steps acronym. Journaling can be a great tool. I love that BetterHelp has journaling as part of, as a feature of the platform. And then connection with others can also be hugely helpful for our ability to self-regulate. So distraction, this is that accepts acronym. So the A stands for activities. So engaging in an activity that requires thought and concentration can be a helpful way for us to distract ourselves. Contributing, so focusing on something, so kind of going back to that spiritual principle of service, focusing on someone else that we can be of service to, or something that we can do to be able to contribute. Comparison, and usually I'm not a huge proponent of comparison, but in this case, it's not comparing ourselves to someone else, but it's comparing our situation to something that could be worse. So you'll hear this a lot of times when people are trying to kind of make sense of something that they're going through. They'll say, oh, well, at least I'm not going through something worse, or, to kind of try to help themselves to feel a little bit better. And actually, this can be helpful for us when we can focus on ways that things could be worse as a distraction. Emotions, so do something that creates a competing emotion. So taking an opposite action is what this is saying. So if you're feeling really angry and you want to yell, whisper instead. If you're feeling really depressed and you don't want to get out of bed, do the opposite, go for a walk. If I'm trying to think of another example. If you're feeling like you don't want to be around people, you want to isolate, go and be in a group of people. So sometimes the way that we feel, there's something about that's helpful about listening to it that we're feeling. And other times if we're in a state of depression or a state of anxiety, it might be helpful for us just to do what's opposite in that situation. So pushing away, do away with the negative thoughts by pushing them out of your mind. And then thoughts, when emotions take over, focus on your thoughts. So pay attention when you're having an intense emotion to what is your thought and what that narrative is, and whether or not you can correct maybe some of those cognitive distortions. We're about to talk about that in a couple minutes. And then sensations, find safe physical sensations to help distract you from intense negative emotions. So similar to that idea of mindfulness that we were talking about earlier. Cool. Okay. So if you can, we'll just spend a minute doing this. If there's a trigger that you can identify for yourself and something that you can do to cope or to distract yourself from that trigger. If I'm tired, I clean. Great. There's something about the emotions part I feel uncomfortable with. It's a risk of not listening to yourself. So not being true to yourself. I agree with you. I do agree with you. It kind of does take a lot of discernment to know, okay, when do I need to listen to myself? And when am I just in a state of depression or a state of anxiety where actually moving a muscle and doing something different is going to help me to get out of this? So I'm not suggesting, or it's not suggesting, this just distracts acronym, being inauthentic. It's just sometimes when we're stuck in a state of depression or stuck in a state of anxiety, and we're continuing to do what it is the depression's telling us to do or the anxiety is telling us to do, a way of getting out of that is to take an opposite action. So an example of that is with trauma. A lot of times we'll want to avoid the trauma trigger, maybe avoid a place where we had a car accident. And exposure therapy is is one of those evidence-based treatment approaches for trauma, and that can be exposing yourself to those places that and really teaching yourself, okay, actually, no, this is safe for me to go back here. Every time I go there, I'm not going to have that trauma response. So I see what you're saying. I do want you to be authentic, but also there can be value to doing opposite of what our depression or our anxiety is telling us to do. I can't open myself to people or always be honest with myself feelings and just distract myself. Okay, I'm going to keep us going because we are, okay, yeah, good. Hopefully that helped. Okay, I'm going to move us along because we only have 11 minutes. And I do want to cover these last 2 topics, which is problem solving and then thoughts. So, problem solving is the process by which we attempt to overcome difficulties, achieve plans that move us from starting situation to a desired goal, or reach conclusions through the use of higher mental functioning, such as reasoning and creative thinking. And there's 5 steps to problem solving. And sometimes we do this just really automatic, but it can be helpful to break it down to the 5 steps so that when we are actively trying to problem solve, we make sure that we're not skipping a step. So defining the problem, we can't problem solve if we're not really quite clear what the problem is. And a lot of times when we get stuck in a shame spiral, we might start to feel like we're the problem. And it's hard to problem solve if we feel like we're the problem. So it is really important for us to define the problem and have that be a problem that's external from us, or something specific about our behavior that we can change, and not feeling like I'm the problem. There's something wrong with me. Brainstorming multiple solutions, and these can be really pie in the sky ideas, because even if they're not practical, we can kind of pick apart parts of it that might be more practical. Assess your solutions and pick one, implement the solution, and then go back and review and evaluate. So that can be an important step that gets missed sometimes, is going back. Okay, is this helping me to achieve getting closer to my ultimate goal, or not? And if it's not, you can go back to the list that you brainstormed and kind of repeat the process. Cool. Okay. So some barriers to problem solving: denial. So as I said, we have to define the problem as the first step. And if we're in denial, we might not be in a place where we're willing to recognize that there's a problem in the first place. Blaming ourselves or blaming others. So as I already mentioned, getting stuck in kind of that shame spiral where we feel like I'm the problem. Also, if we feel like we're to blame, we might want to just kind of deny the problem. And if we're blaming others, then and blaming others can be a very tempting thing to do. But really, when we're blaming others, we're giving them the power, versus us feeling like, okay, no, actually, there's something that I can do in this situation. Learned helplessness can be a barrier to problem solving, being inflexible, and then making assumptions. And this next slide is an example of an assumption of unnecessary constraints. And it's called the 9-dot problem. So the task here is connect all of these 9 dots without lifting your pen. And that may feel kind of impossible if you're looking at it and trying to kind of solve the problem, because a lot of times we assume that in not lifting up the pen, you also can't go outside of the box. So the solution for this problem actually lies in leaving the box to be able to connect all of the dots while not lifting your pen from the paper. So this is an example of how we can make assumptions about where the constraints are, and kind of be inflexible in our problem solving, because we feel like, oh no, we have to stay in this certain box, when really, if we allow ourselves to be more flexible and we check our assumptions, there might be other possible solutions available. So this is just kind of a fun visual example of how we may automatically limit ourselves. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about thoughts. And throughout this 4-part series, we cover thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And this is important because of this cognitive behavioral theory, which most of you have probably heard of. It's a modality in therapy that's very evidence-based, which is based on the idea that our thoughts influence our feelings and influence our behavior. So that there's this interconnected relationship between our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So we talk a lot about our feelings in inward week. Today, during upward week, we're going to talk about our thoughts. And then during the forward week, so next week, we'll talk about our behavior. Being aware of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors can help us to self-regulate, and specifically being aware of our thoughts can be really helpful. So some tips for monitoring our thoughts is I would encourage you, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of pause when you're feeling an intense emotion and kind of ask yourself, okay, what are some of the thoughts that are playing out in my mind right now? And just because we think something does not mean it's true. And that sounds like a simple idea, but a lot of times we do mistake our thoughts for facts as truth, when really just because we're thinking it does not mean that it's true. A lot of our thinking is automatic. So it does take a discipline and a lot of practice to be able to slow ourselves down to pay attention to our thinking. So give yourself grace if you're starting to practice this. It takes a while. Being aware of our thoughts can help us to change our thoughts. A thought record can be a helpful tool for us to be able to write out our situation, thoughts, emotions, behavior, and then also an alternative thought. And then shoulds can be a red flag when we're having a should thought. Because a lot of times when we're having a should thought, we're either shaming ourselves or others. I should do this, I should be this way, or other people should be this way. So those thoughts tend not to be as helpful. And then I already mentioned this, when you notice a feeling, ask yourself what your thoughts are. So some questions that you can ask yourself to challenge your thoughts include, what is the situation? What am I thinking? What is evidence for my thought? Is there evidence contrary to my thought? How might someone else look at this situation? What might be a more positive way to look at the situation? Will this situation matter a year from now? What will happen if I keep telling myself the same thought? And what would be good to do now? So you can kind of walk yourself through these questions as you are practicing challenging your thoughts. Okay, so I want to talk about some cognitive distortions, and then we'll have just a minute or so to do some sharing, and then we'll wrap up for today. So some examples of cognitive distortions is all or nothing thinking. And an example of this is also known as kind of black and white thinking. If I'm not a total success, then I must be a total failure, is an example. Catastrophizing, and I'm very guilty of this, is kind of assuming that I know what's coming and assuming that worst case scenario. So I'll be so upset I won't be able to function at all, would be an example of a catastrophizing thought. Disqualifying or discounting the positive. Because like I said, we do all have a negativity bias. So this might look like I did that project well, but it doesn't mean I'm competent. I just got lucky this time. Emotional reasoning. An example of this is, I know I do a lot of things okay at work, but I still feel like I'm a failure. Labeling, such as telling ourselves I'm a loser or I'm no good, or labeling other people and saying the same thing about them, is not very helpful. Magnifying or minimizing. So magnifying the negative or minimizing the positive. For example, getting a mediocre evaluation proves how inadequate I am. Getting high marks doesn't mean that I'm smart. And then mental filter. So because I got one low rating on my evaluation, it means I'm doing a lousy job. Mind reading. So assuming that we know what other people are thinking. Overgeneralization. Because I felt uncomfortable at the get-together, I don't have what it takes to make friends. So taking one example and generalizing it. Personalization, I think we do a lot of this, and it can be really helpful to not personalize things. So the repairman was curt to me because I did something wrong. Actually, the truth might be that they were curt because they were really tired or frustrated from something that they had done an hour prior. And then should and must statements. It's terrible that I made a mistake. I should always do my best. So again, shoulds can be kind of shaming. And then tunnel vision. My son's teacher can't do anything right. He's critical and insensitive and lousy at teaching. So really like honing in on the negatives. Okay, so if you feel comfortable sharing, is there an example of a cognitive distortion you identify with? And how does this make you feel, and what could you think instead? So go ahead and share whatever you're comfortable with. I'll go ahead and toggle back to these two screens where the cognitive distortions are listed. Personalization, yeah. And a lot of times when we personalize, we feel angry or we feel hurt with the other person. Labeling, all or nothing. Personalization, yeah. Personalization is a really common one. Catastrophizing, I can relate to that one as well. I definitely do the catastrophizing. Overgeneralization, yep. These are all very common ones. Yep. All or nothing thinking, yep. All very common. Thank you all for being willing to share. And because we are just about out of time, I want to thank you all for being here today, tonight, whatever time it is for you. Next week, or for our next session, which will either be next Sunday or look for it later in this month, we'll be moving forward. So please join us for that. Join me for that. The topics will be covered will be goals, self-care, support system, relapse prevention, opposite action, and behavior as well. So please do join me. And thank you again for your time. Here are the references, and these slides should be sent out to you just as soon as this live recording gets sent out to you via email as soon as we wrap up. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day. All right, bye.